my last video, I made cabinet doors for the IKEA shelves, and it kind of blew up.
It got to the front page of printables, trending on MakerWorld, and even to Joseph Prusa's Instagram.
Which is pretty cool, but my favorite part was this. It was seeing all the photos people shared. It blew my mind to see how many people from all over the world were printing something I designed. So thank you all for sharing photos and the kind comments. And if you missed that project, I'll link the video right here and in the description below.
But as I was scrolling through the comments, people were asking how they can make this fit on a mini 3D printer.
I replied, I'm not sure to be honest. I'm hoping someone in this community can think of an elegant solution. Wait, that made me think I should be that someone to think of an elegant solution. So I went back and looked at the old designs. The hinge didn't fit, so I made it a snap fit instead of a print in place. And just like that, it now fits. So how did I not think of this before? To answer that, I think we have to visit my design philosophies. And that's form and function. Does it look good? And does it work? Those are two good fundamentals, but it's just not enough. We can do better. I once worked with this design agency, and they introduced this concept of designing for extremes and not mainstream. If we look at a bell curve, the middle portion is the majority, also known as mainstream. But real breakthroughs happen when you look at the edges, the outliers, also known as the extremes.
For example, if we were to design a sidewalk curb, majority of people would have no problem walking.
But you also have your extreme users, which are people in wheelchairs, people who are moving furniture. So if you think about the extremes, you might come to the conclusion of building ramps on sidewalks. And in my current example, I have people with small build plate sizes and large build plate sizes. And I'm not saying build plate sizes are going to be my main concern every project, but this is a great example of designing for extremes. Because at the end of the day, I think that constraints actually makes you a better designer. This exercise also helps us design with empathy, because if we're not thinking about other people, then who are we designing for? With that said, I'd like to introduce my new design pillars. I call it CHIP. Capable, function should be strong and reliable. Human, design with empathy and edge cases in mind. Intentional, form should have purpose. And the last one, personal. Let people make it their own. And I added personal because I realized one thing I love to do is make things that are customizable. And I want to make it easier to do that. I'm not saying that all my designs will have these characteristics, but it's going to be something I strive to do. So for my next project, I want to take all those learnings and these new design guidelines and create a framing system. And the reason why I want to create a framing system is because a lot of the things I want to make are bigger than my build plate. And a good structurally sound frame will allow us to do that. We'll be able to build doors, shelves, and even cases. I also want this to be the beginning of creating some kind of component library. And my main goal of having a component library is to have all these pieces to make building future projects easier and faster. Let's say for a component library, we made a door handle. Anytime we need a handle, like for a door or for a drawer, we can just go in there and grab that. That way we can focus on the bigger project. And if there is time, we can change the door handle if we want. All right, let's start designing.
In my last project, I used dovetail joints to connect the beams, and I really liked using them. They're strong, reliable, and I love bringing in techniques from other mediums such as woodworking. But I got a few comments from people saying it was hard to install, mostly because printer tolerances can vary. What fits perfectly on my printer might be way too tight or too loose on someone else's. So this time, I tried a different approach. Instead of making the connection part of the beam, I designed a system that uses separate clips. If the fit's too tight, just reprint a different size clip. You don't have to toss away the whole beam. This approach feels more forgiving, and it also opens the door for more customizing how pieces connect, which I'll explore more later.
All right, I printed a bunch of test pieces out, and overall, I'd say it works pretty well. That click is pretty satisfying. Look at that. But I do have a few gripes about this approach. To make a simple box frame, you need a lot of individual pieces. That's fine for flexibility, but it definitely adds complexity. Also, the tighter the connection, the harder it is to assemble. But for the connectors, I'm also using Prusament, which is a lot stronger, but I want to really see how strong the connections can be. This thing is rock solid. Another thing is these beams aren't very dynamic. And what I mean by dynamic is, let's say I'm printing out these beams for a shelf, and I want to adjust the height of the shelf, I would have to print a whole nother beam. But I do like these clips. I definitely see myself using these later on in another project. But while I was printing these, I came across another idea that might be better for our use case. As I was in the garage getting these printed, I walked by these shelves. Beams like this would allow for more configurable options, and a system like this requires less pieces. Because this design, all the beams have pegs attached to it, so we no longer need all those clips. but I want it to be different. I don't want to use the same peg holes that all these garage shelves already have. How can I make these uprights more fun and configurable? What's a twist on it that I can add that people in the 3D printing community would enjoy? And as I was sitting here, this has been sitting on my desk since my last project. It's basically a sample test print of the door hinge. And as I was playing with this, I realized this is a beam. What if I made the SKADIS design our framing system? And just like that, this idea got me extremely excited and I started spiraling. Now that we have our design, let's talk about how we can make it fully customizable. One option is to use Fusion. The caveats there is not everyone uses Fusion, and there's definitely a learning curve. Another option that would be really cool is something called OpenScad. Let's take a look. And this is OpenScad. OpenScad is a free open source platform where you write code to create 3D models instead of a drag and drop interface like Fusion 360 or Blender. And if we take a look here on the left-hand side, you can see all the code base. In the middle is where it renders. And on the right-hand side are all these parameters that I can adjust. And this is where the beauty of OpenScad lies. I can adjust these parameters and it'll automatically update the model. And if you don't want to download the free software, there's also websites you can go to and I'll link them in the description. And this is a model I just pulled up from Printables. If I do a quick search for OpenScad, I can see hundreds of cool models. And if you go to MakerWorld, this is often when you see these customized tags. These are often written with OpenScad. So I think this is the approach I want to take because it's so easily customizable for anyone to use, no matter what skill level you're at 3D printing. But the obvious hurdle here is I don't want to spend time writing code. I honestly think this is the perfect time to use AI. It takes something so intimidating like coding 3D models and turns it into something more accessible and collaborative. It really helps lower the barrier between ideas and execution. But it was not easy. This took me 4 days. First, ChatGPT kept telling me I hit the limit for the day, so I'd have to wait for the next day to make more requests. Then I ended up upgrading and paying for it. But then I realized Claude was actually better at writing code. And there's obviously still a learning curve for writing AI prompts. The thing about talking to AI is it takes everything very literal. And it immediately reminded me of a YouTube video where this dad is teaching his kids the power of descriptive writing, where he follows their instructions word for word on how to make a peanut butter sandwich.
With the butter knife.
No, Dad, with the peanut butter.
I'm just doing what it says. It says, take one piece of bread, spread it around with the butter knife.
And this is exactly how I felt. But despite all that, it's pretty cool. I'm not going to go deep into the details about how I did it. That video would actually be pretty long. With that said, let me show you what I made. To keep things simple, anything vertical, I'll call uprights, and anything horizontal, I'll call beams. Let me show you a few test pieces I printed. So here's a very simple upright. I added half peg holes at the very top and bottom. This is so that when you attach the beams, it'll be able to sit very flushed. And so you can imagine that this is kind of what a frame or shelf would look like. That's pretty cool. But as I was setting this up, I was staring at this upright and I realized something very cool and unique about it. This upright actually turned a two-dimensional SKADIS and made it three-dimensional. The reason why I'm excited is you'll be able to attach multiple things on multiple sides at the same time, as opposed to a SKADIS flat against the wall. And let me show you what I mean by that. Now that we have an idea for a shelf, let's put it to more practical use. I recently got the Mac Mini and I absolutely love it. The only thing is I got the cheaper model, which means I have to buy an external hard drive, and I also have a Cal Digit for more ports. And as you can see here, it immediately tripled the footprint size. I think this is a perfect use case for our new shelf. So let's build it. All right, we have our basic pieces again. We have our uprights and we have our beams. Ignore the ugly color. I ran out of filament, so I just had to switch. While I was making these, I decided to add a parameter called add sidewalls for the beams. I forget if the number is positive, it goes up, and if it's negative, it goes down. I forget. But I thought it'd be a cool feature. Let's assemble it. I think it's pretty cool. I think it's pretty neat. It always helps me to physically create it and assemble it to really understand what kind of revisions I really need to make. And there's a lot of good learnings I can take away from this. One thing I want to brainstorm about is how to make this thinner. The reason why I made it so thick is because I want to be able to attach the beams on this side as well as be able to attach things on the outside, which means that the inside has to be at least 10 millimeters thick. But I think I figured out a different way, which I'll get into later. Another thing is that it just looks a little unfinished. I think it needs a little finesse. For instance, this cavity, I don't like it. So I created a component called end cap, and that will act as a lid to put on top. And that helps it look a little more polished. I also don't like these holes at the top. It kind of reminds me of like a fortress. And I think that if we're not using them, we should be able to get rid of them. So I added a parameter called add top holes and add bottom holes. And you can basically just toggle it off if you don't want to add a top and bottom beam. Another thing is I realized that the shelves kind of create this enclosure that didn't have good ventilation. So what I did is I created a parameter for the beams called add ventilation. And I also made it possible to customize the size of the shapes and distance of the shapes.
Going back to the earlier issue, when the upright is too thin, you can't mount things directly on the opposite side without the pegs colliding into each other. To solve this, I added a feature called alternate pattern. When that's enabled, the holes on the opposite sides are offset, so instead of overlapping, they land in the gaps between the holes on the front. It's basically a mirrored SKADIS pattern. That way you can mount things on both sides of a thin upright without the pegs fighting each other for space. And this is the end cap component I added. And here's a little side-by-side comparison with the new upright versus the old one. I just want to do a quick walkthrough and explain things, and hopefully it'll help you get started. By default, all the parameters are actually set to the Mac Mini shelf. The main components are the upright, end cap. Just for naming, I call this the front, and I call this the side. And so if you go into the components, you'll see front beams and you'll see side beams. And the reason why you see two layers of beams is because sometimes, let's say for instance, it's 80 width, you'll see a different number of peg holes per row. And so this will just accommodate for that. But if the peg holes are the same, then these are actually identical beams. You'll notice that there's some attributes that are tolerance. So for instance, for the end cap, if the end cap doesn't fit, you can actually change the tolerance to make it more loose. And that's the same for the pegs as well. I added a top margin safe area. This is for if a pattern extends past the 10 millimeters, it actually won't generate that shape. This is to prevent any wonkiness that can happen with the peg holes being at the edge. Shell thickness changes the thickness of the upright, but it doesn't actually change the thickness of the pegs. So I don't know how useful this feature actually is. So let's say now you want to start downloading the models. You actually want to start selecting each individual component. You need to render first, and then you can download. And you just have to do this for each individual part. I also want to point out one more thing about the uprights. If you do the alternate pattern, you can't just print two of the same uprights. And that's because the pattern's alternate. Notice how there's one peg hole here, and there's none here. So the beam won't actually connect. What you want to do is you want to mirror one side. And notice this red arrow, this is the x-axis. So what you want to do is you want to mirror along the x-axis. And now your beam should line up. And just to keep everything consistent, everything printed today will be on the Prusa Core 1.
Do you see the vision now? The fact that we can leverage SKADIS, we're able to make it so customizable. And because the SKADIS is so popular in the 3D community, we can really add any attachments that we want. But I obviously didn't stop here. Let me show you a few other things I made. I created a parameter that takes end caps and makes connectors. With these end cap connectors, we can easily combine uprights. I actually got this idea from someone that shared a photo. They were using the SKADIS doors to hang keys from. Let's say you have an apartment and you can't put holes in the wall. I didn't print hooks, so pretend these are hooks. You can use this as a vertical space to hang your keys. You can use it to hang hats from. You can hang some photos while you're at it. And with such a slim profile, it won't get in the way of you using this cabinet shelf at all. Now that we've explored a few designs where it's really thin, what happens if we make it boxier? This one was obviously just for fun and a silly idea. But what I realized was that the cords fit perfectly going out to the bottom holes. So the next progression I had was, I have so many of these extension cords and surge protectors laying around and they look pretty unsightly. So what if we create, bam, a charging station? One thing I had to do was I didn't take into consideration how thick this cord was as opposed to the light bulb. So I just clipped a few pieces away. In hindsight, what I should have done is probably add a negative block in the slicer, and that would have been just an easy fix. Just wanted to point that out just in case you do something like this. And of course, to hide all the mess, we can add a lid. I feel like I'm going crazy. I see SKADIS everywhere now. I found it really hard to stop myself from making more and more features. I think it's important that I take a step back and see if this is something that people actually want and enjoy. So what I'm about to show next is not something that's currently possible using the parametrics or OpenScad, but I want to show you what I hope is possible in the future if people are interested, if this gains more traction. So I created a desk shelf. It's using the same components as using an upright and the beams. But what I did instead is I added Gridfinity to the beams, which means I can make these completely customizable. On another note, I made this. I just really wanted to make a wood grain pattern, and it looks so good. Oh, one more thing. I lied. I made more components. Everybody knows you can't have an IKEA desk riser without Alex drawers. I knew I like rubber feet, but this is so awesome. The way I created this was really cool too. What I did was I took a picture of an IKEA drawer, I converted it to an SVG, and then I imported that SVG into OpenScad. So guess what? These are actually all parametric as well. I created an OpenScad for this too. You can customize any size you really want. And because it's all modular, we can do something like this. Cool, right? It's a mini Alex drawer. My main goal of this project was to create a frame, and the point of a frame was to create an easy fundamental building blocks for people to use in their projects, and I think I was able to achieve that here. This project here also falls in line with my new design principles. They're all very functioning, so it's capable, and because I took in consideration people's build plate sizes and tolerances, I feel like I designed with empathy, so I count that as a yes for human. Leveraging the SKADIS design, everything is very intentional. And everything's personal because it's all customizable. Thank you everyone for watching. If you made it this far, please like, comment, subscribe. It really helps me out. And please let me know if this is something everyone is interested in, if I should continue making components, or if you think this is not the right approach, please let me know. Thank you again and keep making stuff.